Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special Point 1 episode of Discovery Debrief. I'm co-host Chris Clow, and this is just a short addendum to our recently released discussion concerning the timeless Star Trek The Next Generation episode, Tapestry, Rachel's choice for her all-time favorite Star Trek episode in any series in the franchise. As I alluded to, and as we briefly discussed in the primary episode, there was a discussion that I had with a very good podcasting friend of mine a few years ago that dealt with two very different perspectives on Tapestry itself. In 2014, my longtime podcasting cohort BRAD LANGE, who resides in Australia, was developing a podcast with me that was to be called The Fifth Dimension. In it, we were going to get together on a semi-regular basis to discuss the thoughts and ideas, both through the lens of our own perceptions and the authorial intent of the various works' creators, at play in some of our favorite stories. Unfortunately, we only ever recorded a pilot episode, but in that pilot, we discussed two works of fiction that we both felt helped to open our minds to the wider possibilities in the communication of profundity that only fiction can bring. Brad's choice was the excellent novelization of the late 1990s DC Comics story arc Batman No Man's Land, written by one of the Dark Knight's best comics writers, Greg Rucka. Mine, however, in this discussion, was Tapestry. I think it's a discussion very worthy of sharing with those of you out there who appreciate the kinds of conversations we have on Discovery Debrief, while also showing two very different perspectives on a celebrated Star Trek episode. One of them, mine, sings its praises, while the other, Brad's, provides a counter-argument that may be a unique one for Trek fans to hear. We're so accustomed to celebrating Tapestry, but there may be a reasonable perspective that may see something a little alarming about the message the episode communicates. That, of course, is for you to decide. So please enjoy this Point 1 addendum to our regular panel's discussion and wind the clocks back to late 2014 to hear Brad and I duke it out over Tapestry. On one side, an embedded American Star Trek fan. On the other, an Australian clinical psychologist and intellectual heavy hitter with only cursory knowledge of Trek overall. Quite a pairing. I hope you enjoy it.
So what we're going to be talking about today is what phrase did you coin? It's the origins of our geekery.
Yeah, pretty much.
So basically, what we're going to be talking about is we've got two topics that we're going to be approaching today, with the overarching theme to get into this, to let you know a little bit about ourselves at the same time. Is me and Chris have both picked one thing from pop culture, from the geek realm, that we look back upon as being like almost like a turning point, the point when either it triggered our love of certain genres, or when it was revealed to us that, okay, it wasn't just the surface level. It wasn't just the fun, the biff, bam, pow, the good guys versus bad guys element of these pieces of pop culture, that there was something more underneath. So we've both picked a piece. Chris has picked the Star Trek The Next Generation episode from Season 6 called Tapestry. We'll start off with the Star Trek one, shall we?
Well, if you want to. So, I've been a pretty big science fiction fanatic for basically as long as I can remember. I was born in late 1987, which was actually the first year that Star Trek The Next Generation was on the air. And, my brother was a big fan of the show, and he had watched it in its original run. I didn't really come to it until later because I don't think I was fully able to appreciate it until I was just a little bit old. And by just a little bit older, I mean maybe a year after it stopped. So probably 1995, 1996. I'm 7, 8 years old, and I catch a rerun of this episode Tapestry. And if you haven't seen Tapestry, then it features probably one of the absolute best antagonists of the entire series of Star Trek The Next Generation, John Delancey's Q. Q actually showed up in the pilot episode of the show and had plagued the crew of the Enterprise intermittently over all 7 seasons, including the final episode. So I had always really enjoyed Star Trek, particularly the original series as a kid. It was probably just because it was so colorful that I got into it in the first place. And but I remember watching Tapestry on a rerun. It was after I had recently moved to a whole other part of the country. And something in me just unlocked watching this episode. And you know, that's the overall topic. Something in me clicked watching Tapestry. And I started to learn and understand things not just about that episode, but really about thematic fiction in general. Is that, I mean, Tapestry is one of the absolute best episodes of the entire 7-season run of Star Trek The Next Generation. And that's because, you know, from a thematic level, it's pretty easy to get into. It's relatively entry level, especially considering some of the other episodes that would come along later that are a bit more abstract. But Tapestry spoke to me at the time, you know, as a 7 or 8 year old kid. You know, it really gets the point across that you need to do something in your life. You need to make a splash in order to actually really fully succeed. You can coast as long as you want, but by the time you get to the end of the rope, you may regret not doing a certain action, not taking a certain risk. And, you know, these are kind of heavy things for a child to be learning. You know, I never quite looked at mortality the same way again after I watched Tapestry, because the episode really does help present life, a person's life, your life, my life, everyone's life, as a finite moment in time. So with that, with the time that we have, how do we strive to make something of ourselves beyond just existing? And, you know, there are a lot of other great works in literature and film and in television that take, this isn't a new theme, but this episode made it new to me. And, you know, how we employ risk, the nobility and peace of dying with the assurance of a life well lived. And, you know, of course, it's hard to talk to people that have died and ask them, well, do you think you lived a good life? Not really possible, but there's something about Tapestry itself. Not just the fact that it's a fun TV episode to watch, but the fact that it presents life as something to be treasured. There are so many moments where we can take things for granted, where we can look at moments and just think, well, you know, tomorrow's going to come along and we can try and make something better of it. And that's going to be true every day until it's not. And I credit Tapestry with kind of opening that up in my child brain and really shaping how I viewed mortality, but beyond that, also shaping how I view fiction as a gateway to understanding a greater set of ideas. And, you know, that's something that this show will strive to glorify and to subsist on as far as conversation is concerned. There are so many possibilities that we can talk about when it comes to those ideas. And,
well, because this is
for me.
Yeah, I mean, because this is the first episode, why don't you just give us a brief rundown of what the episode was, because we haven't had the opportunity to give people the heads up this time like we will for future.
Sure. Yeah. So
briefly, you know.
Yeah, of course.
Overview. Yeah.
For the 3 of you that have not seen Tapestry, and if you haven't,
well, this was the first time for me seeing it.
In
leading up for this. So
I'm
the 2 others out there, we used to be 4.
But so of course, Star Trek: The Next Generation stars Patrick Stewart as Captain Picard, captain of the Enterprise, and he's mortally injured on an away mission, and they take him to sickbay on the ship, which is basically like a hospital for those of you that really don't know anything about Star Trek.
The word "sick" in sickbay kind of gave that away.
Well, just in case, And so the Doctor is frantically working on him. And it's revealed through this episode that Picard has an artificial heart because of some accident that occurred at some point in his youth. I'm pretty sure that was a revelation that came in Tapestry, is that his artificial heart is failing. And wait, what? He has an artificial heart? And while he is being worked on in sickbay, he is standing in a brilliant white light and sees a being in the distance extending a hand to him, and it looks like he's basically going to heaven. And Picard takes his hand, and who does the hand belong to? It's Q. Welcome to the afterlife, Jean-Luc. You're dead. And from there, Picard is basically confronted with a decision that he made in his youth that we find out later is a building block for the successful career he enjoyed. So if he chooses to, Q basically gives him the opportunity to change that decision. And what happens when he changes that decision? It unwinds the tapestry of his life. And the life that he will have lived is something that is far from acceptable in Picard's eyes.
Yeah, and I've just remembered what it was I was going to say before, because it relates to what you're talking about here, is that one of the things we're going to be doing on this show is spoilers. That, in order to discuss these topics at the level that we want to discuss them, then it's like no holds barred, spoilers are off. So therefore, we're probably not going to be talking about things that are overly recent, like new releases and what have you.
Right.
We're not necessarily going to be reviewing shows and movies and books, although I'm sure elements of that will come through. We're not necessarily going to be recommending things and not recommending things, although I'm sure that will come through as well. So with this episode of Tapestry, I think it's worthwhile to go into specifics, because like I briefly mentioned before, this was my first time watching this episode, and I cannot remember the last time I watched an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation prior to this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not a Trekker, whatever is the politically correct way of referring to you people.
Nobody's perfect.
I assume it's not referring to you as you people is probably a good first step.
Might not be PC.
Yeah. But so yeah, it's not a unknown story trope that's used here, that someone gets to a point in their life and they're confronted with, or they're given a decision to change an element of their past and what that impacts on the future. I mean, I've seen episodes of Simpsons and Family Guy that have done the same sort of thing. So he goes back, and the thing that stands out with this episode is that while the iconic imagery of Jean-Luc Picard is one of civility, he's very stoic, he's quite civilized, well thought out, and very mannered Englishman. But that when we go back into his past, we see that he, in his youth, in his adolescence, when he was first starting out in the Starfleet, he was quite arrogant and cocksure, and he was a ladies' man, and he would rig a game of this weird playing pool, but it's not pool because there's flashing light bounces. Dom Jot, of course, because it's space and the future.
And in the beginning of the episode, when he's talking to Q, he describes himself as, "I was more like you," which I think gets it kind of across. So Q is also very arrogant.
And, that through his arrogance, through his, being a teenager, basically, he gets into a fight with these massive aliens, and one of the aliens stabs him through the heart. And so he goes back, and so the idea is that the man he is, that we know him to be, is very different from the person that he used to be, and that he makes changes in the past to make his past self more like his mature, civilized gentleman self. And then we end up with a alternate 1985, where he's not the captain. He's I forget the exact title, but he's basically.
I think it was an assistant astrophysicist, and he was a lieutenant junior grade, which is almost as low as you can go. So he goes from being a captain to being a lieutenant junior grade. Yeah,
so he's like, we see he's like running errands for the blind black guy that's not Scotty, but is sort of Scotty. What's his name?
Jordy.
There we go.
You need to watch Relics, where they actually meet.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
There you go. Maybe. So the ideas and themes that you're talking about there, that there's the life well spent. That was clearly their intention. That was the message that they were trying to get across, that they wanted to say with this episode. Is that how it rung with you as well?
It's basically, I mean, I had never really thought before in a fashion where, all of my actions in youth would have consequences on things that I would do in the future. So, when the episode starts winding down and Q starts to really explain what the whole point of it was, almost like a Christmas story in a way. Q is recounting to him how that life had changed, how in every major way it was different than the life that he had known as a command officer, as captain of the Enterprise. He chose not to get in the fight with the Nausicaan, something that seems in hindsight very trivial. But as he goes on, he never had a brush with death. He wouldn't take a risk. He wouldn't stand up and be a leader when a leader was needed, just to basically paraphrase. And it all of these things accumulated and made him the man that we all know him to be. So the idea as it was designed was new enough in its presentation to me that was, because,
it was the first time you had come across this idea
exactly.
and the execution. But, when, as an adult looking back, you sort of say that, well, it's sort of been done before.
Yeah. And in hindsight, I understand that. But when I'm 7 or 8 years old, that's, it was a very good way to be introduced to ideas like this. Yeah. And,
but what about now as an adult looking back? Do you still find that those themes are what resonate with you and what you see stand out in that episode?
Maybe, but that might be because of my own biases. When I look back on it now too, I mean, in addition to just the tightness of the actual teleplay, which I really appreciate. There is, I think I appreciate the structural elements of it a little bit more. I appreciate the performances in the episode now, because that's really, I think that's good. It's good material to play with for an actor of Stewart's caliber. As someone who I believe has played Ebenezer Scrooge in the past.
Right. I'm sure he's an elderly Englishman. I think they all have at some stage, but yes.
But I mean, if you wanted to really analyze it to try and go beyond the intended meaning, there might not be that much there. And I understand. I mean, there's some stuff. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, the thing that stood out to me that made me, because I'm approaching this for the first time without any emotional connection to these characters, without much knowledge of them beyond their superficial, I guess, iconic status that is sort of permeated beyond the show itself. So what stood out to me was that this show, or maybe this episode, or maybe a reflection of these characters, were really advocating for arrogance and personal self-interest. That it was very much a about me thing that was going on for the character of Picard, rather than in the interest of the group as a whole. Like, it was very much an individualist perspective. And I guess maybe this is because I'm I'm an outsider, or maybe this is my own biases, but it came across as very much an American view of what a life well lived is. That it's the American dream of that. You will rise to the top, and it is about you achieving the pinnacle, rather than, say, a more collectivist society, a more socialist inclined society, where it is about the benefit of the group as a whole. In that, he goes back to the past and makes decisions that are pretty hard to dispute. It is not a good thing to cheat in a game. It is not a good thing to get into a fight. It is not a good thing to put yourself in a position where you are going to get stabbed through the heart, basically killing yourself. Those aren't good decisions. It is not a good decision to play one girl off another and not really care about the emotional impact on other people. These aren't necessarily admirable qualities to promote. But
you would also be looking at that through hindsight, because when he made those decisions for the first time in his life, he was doing them in the moment. And
absolutely.
So,
and in its defense, that's the perspective that Jean-Luc goes into that situation with. That these aren't good. Yeah, that these aren't good decisions. I'm going to change them. But then by the end of the episode, it kind of the message of the show is flipped back and saying, actually, no, those were good decisions, and you should be, acting before you think, and that sort of thing.
We shouldn't apply a normative perspective of good and bad. These were good decisions for him.
Well, no. See, that's for him,
because for other perspectives, they are not good decisions. But when it comes to the decisions that would lead him to become the man that he is supposed to be, that's what made them positive.
And see, there we go. And this is where the element of this story really stood out to me, is that when he comes back to the future, to the alternate 1985. So as you can tell, my reference points for time travel are fairly limited. But that he comes back and he is still on the Enterprise. He is still serving a very valuable role in the functioning of the ship and the functioning of their missions. He is taking this piece of equipment from one part of the ship to another part of the ship, and it is obviously important because it's the request for him to perform it is coming out over the loudspeakers or whatever, saying, look, I need this piece. Somebody needs to perform that role. It is a necessary role in the functioning of the overall society. But he can't stand that. That is not a life worth living for him. It's like, for him, it's like, I'm either captain or I'm nothing. And it is the functioning of the ship didn't seem to alter based on whether he was at the top of the hierarchy or the bottom of the hierarchy. And, that was one of the conditions that Q said at the start, that if you make changes, it won't be some massive butterfly effect for all of humanity. Right. It will be intentionally just on your life. So, there are questions of whether this was real-time travel and real reality or what have you. And I don't know if future episodes address this or if there's greater context in the mythology of Star Trek that answers some of these questions. But his life as being lower on the hierarchy in his job, in his occupation, was so unbearable that he basically kills himself. He puts himself in a position where he is going to get a blade through the heart, so that his heart is going to have to be recreated as an artificial heart.
To be succinct, he says, I would rather die as the man I was than live the life I just saw. That's the kicker. Look, and it isn't literally, but it's just so arrogant. It is so it's about me. It goes back to the way that he was as a young man. Look, I understand your perspective, but it's really easy to take a viewpoint, especially in a shared fictional universe like the Star Trek universe, that is populated by billions upon billions upon billions of life forms from multiple planets, multiple species, in different parts of the galaxy. Jean-Luc Picard, from a top-down perspective on the Star Trek universe, is a very important figure. So I guess that would be relatively similar to saying, the life of Abraham Lincoln, from a perspective of someone who had an impact on the society.
All right, good point. But then, what this show is then presenting, at least from the character's point of view, is that, and this goes back to the comment that I made on arrogance, is that he's basically saying that, and nobody else could do that. It is me or it is nothing. Oh, I am so important that only I could have done this. If Abraham Lincoln didn't do what he did that resulting in the slaves being freed from captivity, somebody else might have. To say that it is Lincoln, and look, that's not to diminish what Lincoln did or the freeing of the slaves or anything, but to say that it is him or nothing is, I think, a massive overstatement.
Well, and part of it too is that the Star Trek universe has always placed value on the preservation of history as it was originally unfolded. So one of the things that he was afraid of, that he was talking to Q about, was a violation of what in Star Trek what's called the Temporal Prime Directive. So any Starfleet officers that have gone back in time in the past, when they have the opportunity to change events in any capacity, they are not supposed to do it. So
unless it involves whales, then go for it.
Well, that's going to kill everyone. That's a little bit, and he kind of broke it too. But that's another conversation. The overall point, I think, is that you're right. There is a degree of arrogance that he has, but at the same time, if I'm forced to examine the events of my life, or if you were forced to examine the events of your life, and some foolhardy decision that we had made in our youth had led us to a job scrubbing the bottom of garbage cans instead of living relatively comfortable, functional lives, doing whatever it is we're doing now, we might want things to go back to the way that they were. So it's more like Picard had the perspective of being the captain. He was participating in really important events as the captain of the Federation flagship, because that's what the Enterprise is. It's the flagship of the entire Federation. And if he sees... I don't think he's trying to be diminutive to the role that he is fulfilling.
No, it most certainly is, because that's the only aspect of his life that he's become aware of by that point. He only knows his life in the context of his occupation.
Well, but also
he might have had a wonderful wife that he was incredibly happy with, many kids, like a really fulfilling life, but this was just his job, but yeah, it was just very much a
that's an inference though that we can't really we can't
sure,
really
but what I'm saying is that if we are to believe that what was presented in the show was the entirety of his experience, which we have no reason to believe otherwise, then he doesn't know either, which is what I'm saying. That he doesn't know what else his life was comprised of.
Him being in that position.
Mm-hmm.
Is pretty weird just from a perspective of seeing what his rank was, because by that point he's almost a 60-year-old man and he hasn't advanced in rank. He's had one advancement in rank, one minor advancement in rank since his commission as an officer began. Mm-hmm. So he's already had I think it was like almost a 40-year career at that point. And he's just gotten a little bit further, when by all accounts, 40 years into his career, he should probably be an admiral, Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things, too, was that seeing an officer of his relatively advanced age is unnerving, because most people in the rank that he was in at that point were supposed to be maybe 4 or 5 years out of the academy. And he was still stuck in a low-end job on the flagship, sure, but he was in a low-end job with a very low rank because he had never accomplished anything by not taking the risks that he had in his previous life. So it's an extreme example.
Well, yeah, but yeah, I guess I've already said it, and I don't want to keep going around in circles, but it just
No, we got to go to yours pretty soon.
Yeah. There was just such a great devaluation of the role that he was fulfilling. That the fact that he was playing, it may have been a small cog in the machine, but it was a cog in the machine. I doubt that the Enterprise is filled with many redundant positions.
Well, no, it's not. But also the cog in the actual Enterprise that Picard is the captain of, that cog is probably fulfilled by a 22-year-old.
Okay. But it is still a necessary cog to be fulfilled. Sure. His dissatisfaction is from such an egocentric point of view, such a me perspective, that it was just quite jarring to see when the aim of the episode seemed to be that the show seemed to aim to put me in a position where I was like, oh my God, how could you live with yourself? What a terrible life to live. How could you not take chances? Go for it. But I was left thinking, like, what was wrong with that? Geordie needed that piece of equipment. Someone's got to get it to him. This ship needs to function.
He wanted more from his life. He just I really appreciate that perspective. I really do, and I totally understand where you're coming from. But I really don't think that the aim was necessarily there to devalue the position that he had, as much as to see, wow, after taking that new course in his life, he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything. He was in no position to actively advance anything that he was doing. Yes, he got to a great post on a great ship. That's about it, though. That's the sum of your life's accomplishments at that point.
Well, now that is an assumption, which is sort of what I was leaning at before. But also, the thing now, taking into consideration, yes, that I don't have the 5.5 seasons that came before this episode to rely on to inform my opinion, that it is just what is presented in this episode. But you remember that the only hint of his career as a captain that this episode provides is on his failures. That at the beginning, Q says, do you hear those voices? Those are all the people that have died because of your decisions, because of your actions and your inactions. So it doesn't necessarily present Picard as this grand superheroic figure that the universe could not live without. It presents him as flawed, and that so therefore whoever was the captain in alternate 1985 could maybe have done a better job, because there are all these people who died.
And see, if you did have a little bit more contextual familiarization with Q himself, then you would probably, because Q is a trickster, basically.
Right.
He is the grand trickster god of the Star Trek universe. And
is he a god? Like, what is he?
He's basically he's an omnipotent being.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
He comes from a race of omnipotent beings that have always existed, as far as we can understand, as far as we can comprehend. So he snaps his fingers and he can do pretty much anything, and he's always been able to. And there have been some other episodes that explore, what maybe the vulnerabilities of the Q are, maybe some of their history and things like that. But at the heart of it, regardless of what his abilities are, Q is basically Star Trek's Loki. That's the most fundamental perspective that I can give it. So Q, you can tell that Q wanted to lead him to the ultimate realization that he was at.
Of course, and that comes across in the episode as well.
Yeah, of course.
That's absolutely.
John Delancey. So, he wanted to actively lead him to the point that he got to, but Q will always try and dangle your decisions in front of you. And I mean, any commander, anyone in a command situation would likely have to make a decision, as aberrant as it might be, of who lives and who dies, which Picard has had to do in previous assignments in his career. So by dangling those in front of him, he basically just got Picard to play along without him knowing it. And I think that was the overall aim of it. No commander in a military situation is going to have their hands be completely clean. And I think that was the overall point of that. But regardless of all of these things, at the end of the day, I think that the most potent theme out of the episode is the one that it primarily presented, and that's that whether you agree with his own decisions or not, you have to be able to make decisive action in your own life if you want to succeed. And I think that applies to pretty much anything.
The message that they're trying to get across is fine when you in viewing it from that perspective, in that all the pieces that in order to come to the conclusion they want you to come to, the pieces that they lay out in front of you lead you in that direction. But I guess sort of where I was coming from is that those pieces can be looked at from a different side of things, which give the overall a different flavor, not necessarily reducing or diminishing the conclusion that they come to, but that I guess it's more of a ethical slant to it. That the positive outcome is for the individual and the individual's self-interest rather than anything else, and everything else seemed to be just fine. He just didn't like that he was being told what to do, and that doesn't necessarily result in a grand heroic figure in my eyes.
Well, we'll throw that to the listeners as well. If you agree with either my viewpoint or with Brad's viewpoint about the overall point of the episode Tapestry, then feel free to leave a comment or an email through Geek Nation, and it will find its way to us, and we'll see what you think.
Or if you have a different point of view, we're by no means the exhaustive authority on this sort of thing. So
far from it. Far from it.
Let us know.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this rather different kind of discussion about Tapestry. As much as I may disagree with Brad's general position about the episode, the fact that he remains both a formidable debater and a voice that I truly value kind of demanded that I share this conversation with the small but passionate community of Debrief listeners. Brad's not really doing a lot of podcasting anymore, unfortunately, but any chance I can have to amplify his voice is definitely something I relish. He's a good friend, a great podcaster, and most definitely one of the most valued connections I've made as a genre fiction fan. I hope that you found as much value in listening to that discussion as I still find in having actually had it. Anyways, that's going to do it for this brief addendum to episode 25 of Discovery Debrief. As you may have noticed if you listened to episode 25 upon its release, there was a pretty big delay between its recording and when it actually came out. One of the major things that's transpired since we all sat down to record that one is an actual look at footage of Discovery Season 2, along with a boatload of franchise-related news that came out of the San Diego Comic-Con. The biggest Trek convention of the year is also happening right now in Las Vegas, so an abbreviated panel will be getting together very soon to discuss the latest Discovery news and that mind-blowing Season 2 trailer, before we reconvene to talk Zaki's favorite episode in all of Star Trek, The Visitor from Deep Space Nine. So, we'll plan on talking to you again very soon, but until then, please, go boldly, my friends.